Sir, she didn't make the mistake. The piano stopped before the last note could fall, hanging in the air like something unfinished, something waiting to be understood, and for a brief second no one moved, no one breathed. Because in a room where silence was usually designed, controlled, curated like the wine list and the lighting and the perfectly folded napkins, this silence felt different. It felt accidental, almost dangerous, like something had slipped through the cracks of power and polish. And then, just as quickly, the moment broke, dissolving back into soft conversations and clinking glasses. But 10 minutes earlier none of it had happened yet, and Clara Whitmore was still invisible. She moved between tables with the kind of quiet precision that didn't ask for attention, her black apron tied neatly, her blonde hair pulled back in a low knot that had loosened just slightly after 3 hours into her shift, the warm glow of overhead pendant lights catching in the strands but never quite settling on her face. Because people rarely looked that closely, not at someone like her. Not in a place like this where the average dinner bill crossed $200 and the expectations were as polished as the marble bar stretching along the far wall. She carried a tray balanced with 3 glasses of red wine, each filled exactly halfway. The surface of the liquid still despite the movement of her steps, her fingers steady, her breathing even, her eyes attentive but never intrusive, because she had learned a long time ago that the best servers were the ones no one remembered, the ones who appeared just before you needed them and disappeared before you noticed they were there. And tonight was no different, or at least it wasn't supposed to be. Across the room, Julian Cross sat at the grand piano, his posture relaxed but deliberate, fingers gliding over the keys with a quiet confidence that didn't need applause to exist, his music filling the space without overwhelming it, a subtle undercurrent beneath the hum of conversation. And while most guests treated it as background, something decorative, he watched, not in an obvious way. Not in a way that would make anyone uncomfortable, but in the way people do when they've learned that the smallest details often carry the heaviest truths. Then the door opened, and the atmosphere shifted before anyone even turned to look, because presence like that didn't need introduction. It announced itself in the way conversations paused just slightly, in the way a host straightened their posture, in the way a manager appeared from nowhere with a practiced smile already in place. And Victor Langford stepped inside as if the room had been waiting for him, his tailored suit fitting perfectly, his expression calm, controlled, used to being recognized without having to ask for it. And Clara noticed him the same way she noticed everything, quietly, without reaction, her hands adjusting the placement of a fork on a nearby table as she recalculated the rhythm of the evening. Because when someone like Victor entered, everything else adjusted around him, whether people realized it or not. He was seated near the center of the room, a position that didn't just offer a good view but claimed it. And as Clara approached with a fresh set of glasses, she slowed just enough to align with the tempo of the space, her movements seamless, her presence almost untraceable. And yet in that moment, something small shifted, something so subtle it could have been missed entirely, the angle of a glass, the placement of a bottle, a detail so minor it wouldn't matter to most people, except in rooms like this. Details were everything. And Clara saw it instantly, her hand adjusting before the mistake could become visible, before anyone could notice, before it could disrupt the illusion of perfection that the entire evening depended on. And she stepped back, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, as if nothing had happened at all, because in her world, the best corrections were the ones no one ever saw. Victor Langford did not sit immediately. He adjusted the cuff of his sleeve first, a small gesture but deliberate, as if even time itself waited for his permission before moving forward. And when he finally took his seat, the manager leaned in slightly, voice lowered, posture attentive, the kind of deference that was practiced but never rehearsed. And Clara was already there before the moment could fully form, placing the wine list at the precise angle where it could be reached without effort. Her movement quiet, almost invisible, yet exact, and Victor glanced at it without picking it up, his eyes scanning the table instead, the arrangement, the glassware, the bottle that had just been set down, and there it was, that subtle pause, the kind that only lasted half a second but carried weight, because people like Victor did not need to raise their voice to signal something was wrong. They simply allowed silence to do the work for them, and Clara noticed it instantly. the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his gaze lingered on the label of the bottle, and she stepped forward just enough to adjust it, rotating it by a few degrees so the vintage year faced outward correctly, a detail most would never notice, but one that mattered here. One that maintained the illusion that everything had always been perfect, and for a moment it seemed like the correction had worked, the rhythm restored, the invisible line between expectation and reality repaired before anyone could see it break. But then Victor spoke, not loudly, not harshly, just clearly enough for the table to hear. And unfortunately for Clara, the table was positioned where sound carried further than intended. "Is this how you present a bottle in this place?" His tone was calm, almost curious, but there was something underneath it, something that did not ask a question so much as it placed responsibility, and a few heads turned, not out of concern, but out of habit, because people always noticed when authority shifted its attention, and Clara stood still, her hands lightly folded at her waist, her expression composed, her breathing even, and she answered with a simple, respectful tone, "I apologize, sir. I will correct it immediately," even though she already had. Even though the mistake had been fixed before it could exist, and Victor leaned back slightly, his fingers tapping once against the table, not impatient, just deliberate. "You should have done it right the first time." And that was the moment the room changed, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a quiet, almost imperceptible way, like the temperature dropping by a single degree, enough for people to feel it without knowing why. And Clara nodded once, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, as if she accepted the weight of the moment without needing to defend herself, because defending would require explaining, and explaining would require attention. And attention was something she had learned to avoid, especially in places where perception mattered more than truth. Across the room, Julian's fingers continued moving across the keys, but his eyes had shifted, not fully, not enough for anyone to notice, but just enough to catch the exchange, the timing, the sequence of actions that did not quite align with what had just been said. Because he had seen her adjust the bottle before Victor spoke, he had seen the correction happen in real time, and yet the narrative had already been decided, already accepted, already absorbed by the quiet agreement of those who preferred comfort over accuracy. And he kept playing, because sometimes truth needed a moment to settle before it could be heard. And Clara stepped back, her posture unchanged, her presence fading once again into the background. But this time the silence around her felt heavier, not because of what had been said, but because of what had not been corrected. And as she turned to continue her work, carrying an empty tray toward the service station, the faint reflection of the room followed her in. The polished surface of the metal, distorted slightly, like a version of reality that was almost right, but not quite. And behind her, the conversation at Victor's table resumed, smooth, uninterrupted, as if nothing had happened at all. Clara did not slow down as she reached the service station, but the moment she set the empty tray down, her fingers rested on its edge just a second longer than necessary, not shaking, not uncertain, just still, as if her body had paused where her mind refused to. And around her the restaurant continued in perfect rhythm, plates moving, orders being called softly, glasses refilled before they were empty. The quiet choreography of a place that depended on precision more than noise. And yet something had shifted, something subtle but undeniable, because a few of the other staff had noticed, not the details, not the truth of what had actually happened, but the outcome. The fact that a guest like Victor Langford had spoken and a server had stood there receiving it. And in environments like this, perception did not need accuracy to become reality. Clara exhaled slowly, once, then reached for a fresh linen cloth, folding it along the same crease she had used 100 times before, muscle memory guiding her hands while her thoughts remained carefully out of reach, because thinking too much about moments like that did not help. It only made them heavier. And she had learned that weight was something you carried quietly, or not at all. At the far end of the room, Julian's playing softened, not in volume, but in intention, the melody shifting into something slower, more deliberate, as if each note was being placed with care rather than allowed to flow. And his eyes lifted briefly again, just enough to follow Clara as she moved back onto the floor, her posture unchanged, her expression neutral. But there was a difference now, not in how she worked, but in how the space reacted to her, because invisibility, once broken, never quite returns to its original form. And even those who were not paying attention felt it, a faint tension woven into the atmosphere, like a thread pulled too tight beneath the surface. Victor continued his conversation, his voice measured, controlled, discussing numbers, expansions, decisions that carried weight far beyond the room. And yet every so often his gaze flickered back to the table setting, not because anything was wrong anymore, but because something had been. And for people who were used to control, even a brief disruption left a mark. And when Clara returned with a new bottle, her steps were just as steady, her hands just as precise, but this time she placed it without pause, the label aligned perfectly from the first moment, her fingers releasing it with a quiet finality that did not ask for acknowledgement. And for a second, no one said anything, because there was nothing to correct, nothing to question, nothing to point at. And still, the earlier moment lingered, unspoken but present. A woman at the table glanced between Clara and Victor, her smile polite but uncertain, as if waiting for something to resolve, something to be clarified. But Victor simply nodded once, a small, almost dismissive gesture that allowed the evening to continue without disruption, and Clara stepped back again, her eyes lowering slightly, not out of submission but out of habit, the practiced movement of someone who understood exactly where she stood in the hierarchy of a room like this. And yet, across the space, Julian's fingers hesitated for the briefest fraction of a second before pressing the next key, a note landing just slightly sharper than intended, not enough for most to notice, but enough for him to feel, because what he had seen did not align with what had been accepted, and that kind of imbalance had a way of echoing, even in music, even in silence, even in a place where everything was supposed to remain perfectly composed. The evening had settled into a controlled rhythm again. But beneath that surface calm, there was a subtle imbalance that continued to grow without drawing attention, like a crack forming in glass that no one yet realized would eventually spread across the entire structure. And Clara Whitmore moved through it all with the same steady precision, carrying out her duties as if nothing had changed. Yet something within the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be reversed by routine alone. Because once a moment of public doubt enters a space built on appearances, it does not disappear, it simply relocates itself into silence. Victor Langford remained seated at the center table, his posture unchanged, his voice still measured when he spoke to those around him. Yet his attention occasionally drifted toward Clara in brief, almost unconscious intervals, not because he sought her presence, but because something about the earlier inconsistency had remained unresolved in his mind, a detail that did not align with his expectations of control. And for someone like him, even the smallest unresolved detail had weight. Clara, however, showed no reaction to this attention, continuing her work with quiet efficiency, refilling glasses, adjusting table settings, and moving through narrow spaces between guests, as if she had already accepted that she would remain unnoticed regardless of accuracy or effort. And yet across the room Julian Cross was no longer simply observing, because what he had witnessed earlier had begun to settle into something more structured within his thoughts, forming patterns that did not match the version of events that had been accepted by everyone else. And the more he replayed the sequence in his mind, the more certain he became that the truth had occurred in a way no one had acknowledged. He stood from the piano for the first time since the evening began, not abruptly, but with a calm deliberation that drew no immediate attention, and he walked slowly toward the service corridor where staff moved in and out of sight, his eyes scanning details that most guests would never consider, the timing of movements, the positioning of hands, the sequence of interactions between Clara and the table she had served. And what he noticed, there was not a single dramatic revelation, but rather a collection of small, precise actions that together formed a contradiction to what had been said earlier. Clara had corrected the bottle before Victor had spoken, not after, and that difference, though invisible to most, created a fracture between perception and reality that Julian could no longer ignore. He paused near the edge of the corridor, watching as Clara returned from the kitchen area carrying a fresh set of linens, her expression unchanged, her steps consistent, and for a brief moment he considered speaking, yet the weight of the environment held him still, because he understood instinctively that truth, when introduced too abruptly, could be rejected before it was even heard. especially in a room where hierarchy shaped perception more than observation. Instead, he returned to the piano, sitting down without interruption, allowing his fingers to rest above the keys without pressing them. And in that quiet suspension, he realized that the next time the imbalance revealed itself, it would not remain unnoticed, because certain truths did not require force to emerge, only timing, and timing was already beginning to shift in a way that the room would soon feel, but not yet understand. The restaurant had returned to its surface calm, but it was no longer the same kind of calm that had existed before, because something had been introduced into it that could not be removed simply by resuming conversation or continuing service, and Clara Whitmore felt it in the subtle way people now looked at her when she passed, not directly, not openly, but in brief pauses of attention that disappeared the moment they were noticed, like thoughts that were never meant to be shared aloud. She continued moving through the room with steady precision, collecting empty plates, replacing water glasses, adjusting silverware that did not need adjusting. Yet each action now felt slightly heavier, not in her hands, but in the space around her, as if the environment itself had begun to register her differently. Victor Langford remained at his table, still composed, still in control of his conversations, yet his focus was no longer entirely present in the discussion he was having, because fragments of the earlier moment kept returning without invitation, not as emotion, but as calculation, replaying in his mind with the kind of detail that suggested uncertainty rather than anger. And uncertainty was something he rarely allowed to exist without resolution. Across the room, Julian Cross sat once again at the piano, but he was not playing, his hands resting lightly above the keys, as if waiting for an internal signal that had not yet arrived. And his attention was no longer divided between music and observation, because what he had seen had moved beyond curiosity into responsibility, not in a dramatic sense, but in a quiet recognition that truth, once identified, carried its own weight regardless of whether it was acknowledged by others. Clara passed near the edge of the piano area carrying a tray of used glassware, her steps unchanged, her expression still controlled. But Julian noticed something now that he had not fully recognized before, not a change in her behavior, but the absence of reaction itself, the way she continued as if nothing had happened at all, even though something clearly had, and that absence of response spoke more loudly than any defense could have. For a brief moment, their eyes nearly aligned, not in confrontation, but in recognition, and then Clara looked away first, not because she was avoiding him, but because she had learned long ago that acknowledgement often created expectations, and expectations were rarely safe in places like this. Julian slowly stood again, this time without hesitation, and walked toward Victor's table, his movement calm but intentional, and as he approached, the surrounding conversation seemed to soften without stopping, as if the room itself sensed a shift in direction. Victor looked up as Julian stopped beside the table, his expression controlled, questioning but not hostile, and Julian spoke in a voice that was measured, almost conversational, but carried an underlying certainty that did not seek permission. I believe there was a misunderstanding earlier regarding the bottle presentation. The words were simple, but they altered the space around the table in a way that was immediate and quiet, and Victor's gaze narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in evaluation, as if assessing whether the statement was relevant or unnecessary. And Julian continued without raising his voice. I saw the adjustment happen before any comment was made. A brief silence followed, not empty, but dense, filled with the kind of attention that does not move forward easily, and Clara, standing a few steps away, stopped her motion entirely, tray still balanced in her hands, not because she was startled, but because she understood the significance of interruption in a place built on controlled narrative. Victor did not respond immediately, and in that delay something shifted again, not outwardly, but internally, because now there were two versions of the same moment occupying the same space, and both could not remain unexamined forever. Julian did not press further. He simply held the moment long enough for it to exist fully, and then stepped back, returning to the piano with the same calm he had arrived with, as if nothing more needed to be said for now, while Clara resumed her movement slowly, not altered in form, but no longer entirely invisible, because once truth has been spoken aloud, even softly, it begins to change how silence is perceived. The moment after Julian returned to the piano did not feel like an ending, but rather like a pause that refused to resolve, as if the entire room was holding its breath without realizing it. And Clara Whitmore could feel that weight more clearly now as she moved between tables, because what had once been background noise and invisible rhythm had become something slightly misaligned, like a clock that still worked, but no longer matched the time everyone expected it to show. Victor Langford remained seated, his expression unchanged to anyone watching casually, but internally the sequence of events had begun to separate into layers that he could no longer compress into a single interpretation, and that discomfort did not manifest as emotion but as calculation, because for someone who built certainty through control, ambiguity was not just inconvenient, it was unstable. Around him, conversation continued, yet it carried a faint hesitation, as if the room itself had become aware of a question that had not been answered properly, and questions in spaces like this had a way of lingering longer than answers ever did. Clara passed behind the service station again, her steps consistent, her posture unchanged, but her awareness sharpened in a way that did not show externally, because she understood the shift had moved beyond her individual presence and into perception itself, and perception once altered rarely returned to its original simplicity. Julian's fingers finally touched the piano keys again, but the sound he produced was different now, not in technique, but in intention, because he was no longer playing only for atmosphere, but for structure, as if the music had become a way of organizing what could not yet be spoken directly, and the first few notes carried a restrained clarity that subtly drew attention without demanding it. Victor's gaze moved briefly toward the piano, then back to the table, and in that small movement, there was a subtle recalibration happening, not of authority, but of understanding, because the presence of contradiction in what had already been stated could no longer be ignored without consequence. Clara stopped briefly near a side station, adjusting a stack of clean glasses that did not require adjustment, her fingers moving through habit while her thoughts remained measured and contained. And for the first time that evening, she became aware not of being observed, but of being reconsidered, which was entirely different and far more significant, because observation could be dismissed, but reconsideration implied the beginning of interpretation. A nearby guest asked a quiet question about the wine service, and Clara responded with the same calm precision as before, yet even in that interaction there was a subtle change in timing, a fraction of hesitation from the listener before accepting her answer, as if they were no longer processing her role in the same automatic way. Julian continued playing, and the melody now carried a restrained tension, not dramatic, but deliberate, each note placed with an awareness that mirrored the situation unfolding across the room. And Victor finally leaned slightly back in his chair, not withdrawing, but observing more fully, as if allowing himself to see the room again without the assumption that had guided him earlier. Nothing was resolved, nothing was concluded, yet the structure of certainty had begun to loosen, and in that loosening the smallest actions carried new weight, the movement of a glass, the pause before a response, the way silence settled after a sentence, all of it now contributing to something that was no longer just an evening, but a sequence of moments being quietly reinterpreted in real time. And Clara continued working through it all without resistance, because she understood that once perception begins to shift, the most important thing is not to force it, but to let it reveal itself fully before it settles into something permanent. The room had settled into a strange equilibrium where nothing outwardly changed, yet everything carried a different weight than it had before, and Clara Whitmore could feel it in the way footsteps seemed slightly more measured around her, in the way conversations paused a fraction longer before continuing, as if people were subconsciously adjusting to a detail they did not yet know how to categorize. And Victor Langford remained at his table with the same composed posture, but the stillness in his expression now carried the faint trace of calculation rather than certainty, because Julian Cross had introduced something into the evening that could not simply be dismissed without examination. Julian sat at the piano without playing for a moment, his hands resting lightly above the keys, and in that pause the entire room felt suspended again, not in silence, but in anticipation, as if sound itself was waiting for permission to continue. And when he finally pressed the first note, it was not part of a melody but a single tone, clear and deliberate, drawing attention not through volume but through placement. And then he spoke without standing, his voice calm, steady, and controlled, enough that it carried across the room without forcing itself into it. There is something important that should be understood about earlier. The conversation at nearby tables softened instinctively, not because it was demanded, but because tone alone had shifted the environment, and Clara stopped moving entirely, her tray held at a precise angle against her side, not reacting outwardly, but fully aware of what direction this moment was beginning to take. Julian continued, his gaze not fixed on Victor alone, but on the space between all of them, as if addressing not a person but a structure of understanding. The adjustment on the table setting was completed before any comment was made. The sequence of actions was visible. There was no accusation in his tone, only clarification, but clarification in a space built on hierarchy carried its own form of disruption, because it challenged not just a statement, but the acceptance of that statement by others. Victor's expression did not change immediately, yet something in his posture shifted slightly, not defensive, but more focused, as if recalibrating how the moment should be interpreted in real time. And for the first time that evening, his attention fully settled on Clara, not as a server moving through the background, but as the subject of a sequence that now required re-examination. Clara remained still, her eyes lowered, not in submission but in control, because she understood that reacting too early would turn observation into interpretation, and interpretation was no longer hers to control in this moment. A faint murmur passed through a nearby table, quickly suppressed, not because it was inappropriate, but because uncertainty had begun to spread quietly through the room, and uncertainty was always contained first through silence. Julian's fingers returned to the piano, but he did not yet play a full progression, instead allowing short, spaced notes to form a pattern that felt less like music and more like structure, each sound reinforcing the presence of what had just been stated, not emotionally, but logically, as if the room itself was being asked to reassemble the timeline it had assumed was already complete. Victor finally leaned forward slightly, his hands resting together on the table, and when he spoke, his voice remained controlled, but the certainty that had previously defined it was no longer absolute. You are saying you observed the sequence differently. It was not a question of denial, but of reassessment, and Julian responded with the same calm precision. I am saying the sequence occurred differently from how it was described. The distinction was subtle, but in that distinction the structure of the evening shifted again, because description had been accepted as fact, and now fact required reconsideration. Clara exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, her grip on the tray steady, her posture unchanged, but the space around her no longer treated her as background, and she could feel that change not as attention, but as awareness forming in others who had not previously thought to question what they saw. The room did not erupt, it did not react loudly, but instead it entered a state of careful recalibration, where each person began to reprocess what they believed they had already understood, and in that quiet transition, truth did not announce itself. It simply began to occupy space that had previously been filled by assumption, and Julian allowed the final note he had been holding to fade naturally into the air, leaving behind a silence that was no longer empty, but newly defined. The silence that followed Julian's final note did not feel empty anymore. It felt structured, as if every person in the room had been forced to rebuild their understanding of what they had just witnessed, and in that reconstruction nothing remained fully stable, because certainty once disturbed rarely returns in its original form, and Clara Whitmore could sense that shift most clearly in the way people no longer looked through her, but around her, as if her presence had become part of an equation that required solving rather than ignoring. Victor Langford remained still for several seconds after Julian's statement, his gaze fixed on a point that was no longer the table, nor Clara, nor even the piano, but something internal where interpretation was actively being recalculated, because what had just been introduced was not contradiction in the emotional sense, but inconsistency in sequence, and for someone who built control through verified order, that kind of inconsistency demanded attention. He finally spoke again, his voice measured, but lower than before, not out of defeat, but out of focus. You are certain of what you observed. It was not phrased as disbelief, but as verification, and Julian Cross responded without hesitation. his tone unchanged. I am certain of the order in which it occurred. That distinction again settled into the room like a weight that did not fall, but spread, because it did not accuse, it only clarified, and clarification without emotional framing often carried more impact than confrontation. Clara stood a few steps away from the main table, her tray now resting lightly at her side, her posture unchanged, yet internally aware that she was no longer simply a function of service within the room, because the narrative around her had begun to shift outside of her control, and that shift did not require her participation to continue. A guest near the window leaned slightly toward another, whispering something brief, then stopping mid-sentence, as if deciding that language itself had become uncertain in this context, and that hesitation spread quietly, not as noise, but as pause, moving from table to table without announcement. Julien returned fully to the piano, but he did not resume a continuous melody, instead spacing out notes in a deliberate pattern that felt almost investigative, as if the instrument had become a way of mapping the emotional geometry of the room, and each sound marked a point where perception had to be reconsidered. Victor's attention remained fixed now, not on Julien alone, but on Clara as well, and this time it was no longer passive observation, but active reassessment, because the contradiction he had been presented with could not exist without source, and source required context, and context required revisiting what had already been dismissed. Clara noticed the shift in attention, but did not respond to it, because response would imply ownership of the situation, and she understood clearly that the situation was no longer hers to define. Instead, she adjusted her grip on the tray slightly, and continued moving, placing glasses, clearing space, maintaining rhythm, but now every movement carried a different kind of visibility, not louder, not slower, but more accounted for. Julien played a short sequence that resolved into a soft, unfinished cadence, then stopped again, allowing the silence to return, but this time the silence did not reset the room, it revealed it, because what remained unspoken had now been exposed to interpretation. Victor finally leaned back slightly, not in dismissal, but in reconsideration, and the conversation at his table did not resume immediately, because even those not directly involved in the exchange had begun to sense that the structure of the evening had changed from presentation to evaluation. Clara passed behind the service station once more, and for the first time that night, no one looked away immediately when she entered their peripheral view, not because she demanded attention, but because attention was now being redistributed without instruction, and in that redistribution, every detail that had once been invisible began to exist differently, not as change in fact, but as change in perception. Victor Langford did not speak immediately after the last silence settled, and in that delay the entire room seemed to hold its structure in a fragile balance, as if any additional word could either stabilize or completely redefine what had already been set in motion, and Clara Whitmore remained in motion through it all, continuing her work with the same measured precision, yet now fully aware that nothing she did existed in isolation anymore, because every action had become part of a sequence that others were actively reinterpreting. Victor finally shifted his gaze from the middle distance back to Julien Cross, his expression no longer anchored in certainty, but in careful reassessment, and when he spoke this time, his voice carried a different quality, not weaker, but stripped of assumption. You are suggesting that what I understood earlier may not be accurate. It was not phrased as concession, but as controlled acknowledgement of uncertainty, and that distinction alone marked a structural change in the dynamic of the room. Julien did not immediately respond, and that pause itself became part of the communication, because he was no longer rushing to convince, only allowing the situation to fully exist in its corrected form, and when he finally spoke, his tone remained steady. I am not suggesting interpretation. I am referencing observation. The simplicity of that statement carried more weight than elaboration, because it removed emotion from the equation entirely and replaced it with sequence. Around them, the room did not react outwardly, but internally the adjustment was already underway, conversation slowing, gestures becoming more deliberate, attention redistributed in subtle increments that no one explicitly agreed to but everyone participated in. Clara placed a set of glasses onto a nearby table, her hands steady, her movement unchanged, Yet she could feel that she was no longer simply passing through the environment unnoticed, because now even absence of reaction was being interpreted as information. Victor leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced on the table, not in confrontation, but in processing. And for the first time that evening, his attention remained fixed on Clara for longer than a passing glance, not as a server, not as background, but as the origin point of an unresolved inconsistency. Julian resumed a slow progression on the piano, but the music no longer functioned as atmosphere. Instead, it acted as a quiet structure supporting the unfolding awareness in the room, each note spaced with intention, each pause allowing meaning to settle before the next sound arrived. Clara continued her route through the space, yet the environment around her had changed in a way that required no direct acknowledgement, because she could feel that the interpretation of her actions was no longer automatic. It was now active, being constructed in real time by those who had previously not needed to think about her presence at all. A guest near the center table finally spoke in a low voice, not addressing anyone directly, but adding a fragmented observation about timing. And that small interruption was enough to confirm that the room had crossed into a new state, where passive acceptance had been replaced by careful reconsideration. Victor did not respond to the comment immediately, instead allowing it to exist alongside Julian's earlier statement, as if comparing two separate layers of reality within the same moment. And in that comparison, the earlier certainty that had guided his reaction began to lose its coherence. Clara paused briefly near the service station, her posture still composed, her expression unchanged, yet internally aware that the evening had reached a point where outcomes were no longer determined by authority alone, but by alignment between observation and acknowledgement, and that alignment was no longer stable. Julian allowed the final notes of his current sequence to fade naturally, not ending the music, but releasing it into silence with intention, and when the silence returned, it no longer functioned as absence of sound, but as presence of unresolved truth, holding the room in a state where nothing had yet been concluded, but everything had already begun to change. Clara Whitmore did not leave her position, but the room around her no longer felt like the same environment she had been moving through earlier that evening, because the structure of attention had changed in a way that could not be reversed by routine, and she could sense it in the smallest behaviors of others, the way a glance lasted slightly longer, the way a conversation paused before mentioning her presence, the way silence itself now carried intention rather than absence. Victor Langford remained seated, his posture still composed, but his stillness was no longer absolute control. It was measured evaluation, as if every piece of information he had previously accepted was now being held up against a different standard, and for someone who relied on certainty to define authority, even slight inconsistency required full recalculation. Julian Cross sat at the piano without playing for several seconds, his hands resting lightly above the keys, and when he finally pressed a soft sequence of notes, it was not to fill the space, but to mark it, to define it, as if the sound itself was serving as a reference point for everything that had been said and everything that had not yet been resolved. The room did not react outwardly, yet internally something had shifted into a sustained state of awareness, where each table, each movement, each pause was now being processed with deliberate attention rather than assumption. Clara moved through the space carrying a tray of empty glassware, her steps steady and unchanged, but she no longer felt invisible in the same way, because invisibility had been replaced by observation, and observation carried weight even when unspoken. Victor's gaze followed her again, longer this time, not intrusive, but focused, as if he were reconstructing her role within the sequence of events rather than simply witnessing her presence, and that reconstruction was beginning to override his earlier interpretation. Julian continued with another short progression, then stopped, allowing the resonance of the final note to fade completely into silence, and that silence did not reset the room, it deepened it, because now silence was not absence of information, it was containment of it. A guest near the center table shifted slightly in their seat, lowering their voice as they spoke, not because they had been asked to, but because the environment itself no longer supported casual certainty, and every statement now felt subject to internal review. Clara placed the tray down at the service station, adjusting its position with habitual precision, But her awareness remained fixed on the change that had occurred without formal declaration, because she understood that moments like this did not resolve quickly. They stabilized slowly, through repetition and acknowledgement over time. Victor finally spoke again, his voice controlled but no longer absolute. If what has been observed is accurate, then the conclusion earlier may require revision. The phrasing was deliberate, not an admission of defeat, but a structured opening of possibility. And in that distinction, the dynamic of the room shifted again, because authority was no longer expressed as certainty, but as willingness to reassess. Julian did not respond immediately, and the pause itself became part of the exchange, because it allowed the statement to exist without resistance or reinforcement. And when he finally spoke, his tone remained steady. Revision is only necessary when sequence and interpretation do not align. The simplicity of the response removed emotional framing entirely, leaving only structure. Clara remained still for a moment longer than usual before continuing her movement, not because she hesitated, but because she could feel the recalibration reaching a point where her actions would now be interpreted through a different lens, and that lens was still forming. The room did not reach resolution, but it entered a quieter state of alignment, where certainty had been replaced by careful reconstruction, and every participant, whether speaking or silent, was now part of an unfolding correction that had not yet finished taking shape. The room no longer felt like it was holding its breath, because what had once been tension had slowly transformed into understanding, not complete, not final, but enough to soften the edges of what had previously felt sharp and uncertain. And Clara Whitmore stood near the service station for a moment longer than usual, her hands resting lightly on the edge of a clean tray, not because she was waiting, but because something in the atmosphere had finally stopped pushing against her presence. Victor Langford remained seated, but his posture had changed in a way that was subtle rather than dramatic, no longer anchored in control alone, but in reflection, as if the sequence of events he had witnessed and reevaluated had settled into a clearer form that no longer required resistance to exist. And when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the earlier rigidity, only measured clarity. It appears the sequence of events was not aligned with my initial interpretation. There was no need for further defense in his tone, because the correction itself had already become the conclusion. Julian Cross did not respond immediately, and instead allowed the silence to exist fully, not as pressure, but as resolution forming. And when he finally placed his hands back on the piano keys, the notes that followed were softer than before, no longer investigative, no longer structural, but fluid, carrying a sense of release rather than analysis, as if the music had shifted from questioning reality to acknowledging it. Around the room, conversations resumed slowly, but they no longer carried the earlier uncertainty, because what had been unstable had now been redefined, not through confrontation, but through alignment of what had been seen and what had been understood. Clara finally moved again, not with hesitation, but with continuity, collecting a final set of glasses and returning them with steady precision. Yet this time, she felt something different in the way she passed through the space. Not invisibility, not scrutiny, but recognition without demand, a quiet acknowledgement that did not require words to exist. Victor's gaze followed her once more, but this time it did not linger in analysis. It rested briefly in acceptance, and then returned to the table in front of him, where nothing needed to be corrected further, because the correction had already been made internally. Julian continued to play, but the melody had now fully transformed into something gentle and resolved, each note spaced with intention not to reveal truth, but to settle it, and the room gradually returned to its natural rhythm, not the one it had before the disruption, but a new rhythm shaped by awareness, where silence and sound coexisted without tension. Clara paused once near the edge of the room, looking briefly toward the piano, and in that moment there was no hierarchy, no misunderstanding, no need for explanation, only a shared recognition between presence and perception. And then she continued walking, not away from anything, but forward into the rest of her evening as it now quietly existed. The final notes of the piano faded naturally, leaving behind a calm that no longer felt fragile, but complete. And in that completeness, there was something simple and human, a sense that dignity had not been spoken into existence, but revealed through the way truth had been allowed to settle without resistance. And as the evening came to its quiet end, it became clear that nothing had been lost in the correction, only clarified, and in that clarity, everyone present carried something with them that did not need to be said again, only understood.